The box was empty. It shouldn't have been. The cheese was gone. But in its place, something far more dangerous gleamed under the dim light. A jewel that should have never been there. A gasp echoed through the room. Rosina Nunn's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she clutched her chest. My opal, but how? Across the table, someone abruptly stood up, knocking over a chair. The sound sliced through the stunned silence. Without a word, Naomi Carlton Smith rushed out into the night. Quin followed. For a full minute, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Henry Judd cleared his throat. God bless my soul. What trick is this? No one had an answer, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a trick. This was a revelation. A year-old crime, a man behind bars, and a truth buried beneath deception. Until now, Mr. Charles Whitmore had never planned to set foot on Raven's Isle. The place had a reputation, a cursed reputation. But Lady Eleanor insisted, and when a woman of her stature commanded, one had little choice. She was a countess of old blood, the last of the Winthorpe line, and despite her age she carried herself with the kind of arrogance that made men twice her size shrink in her presence. Charles, ever the refined observer of society's elite, found himself both irritated and intrigued by her. It had started with a letter, sealed with a crest long thought forgotten. Come at once. There is no time. That was all it said. Cryptic, urgent, impossible to ignore. The next evening, Charles found himself aboard a creaking ferry, watching the dark outline of Raven's Isle rise from the mist. The voyage was not one of leisure. The captain, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, spoke little, but the few words he did utter were warnings, half-muttered tales of disappearances, of voices whispering through the cliffs, of a shadow that moved where no man should be. Lady Eleanor greeted him at the shore, her piercing eyes glinting under the lantern's glow. You were the only one who would come, she said. Her voice steady but cold, she led him up the winding path to the estate, a looming decayed mansion that reeked of history best left undisturbed. As they entered the great hall, a gust of wind extinguished the candles. In the sudden darkness, a sound echoed through the corridors, a shuffle, a breath. Not their own. There's someone else here, Charles murmured. Lady Eleanor exhaled sharply. Not someone, something. A chill ran through him. The doors slammed shut behind them. The last shadow had awakened. Mr. Whitmore was not the kind of man who sought adventure, yet there he was, seated uncomfortably on a rusting ferry bound for an island that few spoke of, and even fewer dared visit. It was the Countess who had insisted, and when the Countess insisted, even the most rational of men found themselves doing the unthinkable. She was an imposing woman, draped in outdated silks, and adorned with gems that had seen better days, her sharp eyes forever gleaming with an air of mischief. Corsica is overrun with tourists, she had declared, wrinkling her nose. What we need is an escape, to somewhere untouched, somewhere steeped in history and secrets. That last word lingered, making Whitmore uneasy. He preferred the comfort of well-lit drawing rooms and polite society, not the unpredictable nature of forgotten lands. Yet, there he was, braving the salt-sprayed deck, his stomach twisting with each violent lurch of the boat. The Countess, in contrast, was thriving. She struck up conversations with strangers, laughed at the crew's crude jokes, and devoured hard biscuits she had brought along, leaving Whitmore to suffer in silence. The journey was long, the sea merciless, and by the time they reached shore, Whitmore felt as though he had left half his soul behind in the churning waves. But the island was nothing like he had expected. The dock was eerily silent, no welcoming party, no bustling port, only an expanse of towering cliffs, and an ancient fortress silhouetted against the twilight sky. Magnificent, the Countess whispered, eyes alight with intrigue, but Whitmore felt something else, something unspoken lurking beneath the island's beauty, a presence, a warning. And when the first scream echoed from the fortress, slicing through the thick air, he knew at once they had come to a place where no one left unchanged. The Duchess, ever unbothered by discomfort, stepped off the gangway with an air of triumph, her sharp eyes scanning the bustling dockside. The town of Valeria was bathed in golden dawn, palm trees swaying as a chorus of fishermen, merchants and beggars filled the air with a cacophony of voices. Mr. Grayson, trailing behind her, wiped his brow, exhaustion evident in his pallid complexion. "No rest for the wicked, eh, Grayson?" the Duchess quipped, unfazed. "Honestly, the lower classes make such a fuss over the smallest inconveniences." The gangway shuddered underfoot, as luggage was wrenched from hands with an almost violent enthusiasm. A wiry man in a tattered hat barked in rapid French, directing the frenzied porters. "On dirait qu'ils n'ont jamais fait ça avant," muttered a stout Frenchman beside them. Grayson exhaled sharply. "If I don't get a hot bath and a proper meal soon, Duchess, I may simply expire." "So dramatic," she scoffed, marching ahead. The hotel loomed in the distance, its shutters flung open to let in the crisp morning air. Inside, they were greeted by an overzealous manager, bowing repeatedly. "Madame, Monsieur, welcome." He gestured them to their rooms. The Duchess's suite, naturally, boasted an attached bath, while Grayson was directed to a dimly lit corridor, where a shared bath occupied what seemed to be an abandoned servants' quarters. The water, predictably, was ice-cold. Later, over an unreasonably bitter cup of coffee, the Duchess surveyed the room with an arched brow. "Ah, there she is." Her lorgnette zeroed in on a woman seated alone by the window, a slender figure, hunched slightly, her dark hair disheveled, her dress a shapeless thing in an unflattering shade of brown. Naomi Caldwell, Grayson guessed, ever adept at placing people. The Duchess nodded. Once promising, brilliant even, but too proud, too reckless. And then, that awful scandal last winter. Scandal, you must remember, that dreadful affair in Chelsea. The playwright, what was his name, stole a fortune in jewels and disappeared. Some say she was involved, some say she knows where he is. Grayson's interest sharpened. He studied the woman more closely. There was something off in the way her fingers drummed idly against the table, her gaze flitting ever so subtly toward the entrance, as if expecting someone or avoiding them. "She's brooding," the Duchess declared. "I won't have it." With the confidence of a woman accustomed to shaping destinies, she swept across the room and placed a firm hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Well, Naomi?" Still too proud to acknowledge an old friend, Naomi barely looked up. "I saw you arrive." Her voice was lazy, detached. "When you've finished sulking, join me on the terrace," the Duchess commanded. There was the faintest flicker of something, hesitation, amusement, but then Naomi shrugged. "Fine." Later, outside in the sun-drenched courtyard, Naomi sprawled into a chair, stretching out her legs ungracefully. Her sharp, angular face caught the light, a face that was nearly beautiful, but not quite. There was something restless in her expression, a shadow of something deeper. "Well?" the Duchess pressed. "Still painting." "A bit." "Show me." Naomi smirked. She was unimpressed by the Duchess's authority, perhaps even amused by it. She retrieved a worn portfolio and flipped it open. Grayson leaned in, intrigued, and then something in the paintings made his breath hitch, because in the chaotic brush strokes, in the strange distorted colors, in the way the figures bled into the shadows, there was something hidden, a face, a clue, a secret Naomi Caldwell wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The dimly lit cafe at the edge of the city buzzed with a quiet, uneasy energy. Amid the scattered patrons, a lone woman sat near the window, absently stirring her coffee. Her sharp, calculating gaze flickered toward the entrance as an imposing figure stepped inside. Lord Ashford, a man with an air of old money and quiet ruthlessness, swept his eyes across the room before making his way toward her. "You've been avoiding me, Celeste," he said, settling into the seat across from her. Celeste smirked, tapping her painted nails against the porcelain cup. "Not avoiding, my lord, just choosing my company wisely." His lips curled into a mirthless smile. "And yet here you are." Celeste tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she had already solved. "You don't leave much room for refusal. But tell me, does this visit concern business or pleasure?" "That depends," he mused, sliding a small velvet pouch across the table. It was weighty, the unmistakable sound of metal against metal whispering from within. Celeste's fingers hesitated over the drawstrings before she pulled them apart, revealing a collection of ornate, unfamiliar coins. They gleamed under the dim light, but the sight of them made her inhale sharply. "Where did you get these?" she asked, voice lower now, controlled. "You tell me," Ashford countered, leaning forward. "You and I both know these haven't been seen in circulation for over a century." A strange hush fell between them. Outside, the streetlights flickered ominously, as though the night itself was warning them. Celeste picked up one of the coins, running her fingers over the intricate engraving, an insignia she knew all too well, the crest of the Montclair family, a family that had been erased from history after their sudden disappearance in 1872. Her grip tightened. "This isn't possible." Ashford's gaze sharpened. "And yet here they are. Someone has been digging into secrets that were meant to stay buried, and you're going to help me find out who." A slow, wicked smile crept across Celeste's lips. "Oh my dear Lord Ashford, you have no idea what you've just stepped into." At that moment, the cafe door creaked open again. A man in a dark coat entered, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Celeste's breath hitched. She recognized that stance, that presence. The past had finally caught up with her, and this time there was nowhere to run. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, his gaze lingering on the strange painting before him. "This unsettles me," he murmured. "Good," Naomi replied, a sly smile on her lips. "That means it's doing its job." The painting was a swirling, chaotic depiction of something vaguely organic, a cluster of twisted thorns, and what appeared to be a half-decayed flower, its deep crimson hues bleeding into the surrounding canvas like an open wound. Mr. Whitmore grimaced. "It feels almost alive." Naomi tilted her head. "It should. That's the nature of decay. Beautiful, isn't it?" The Duchess, who had been silently observing, cleared her throat. "It seems anyone can call themselves an artist these days," she scoffed. "No need to actually paint anything recognizable. Just throw some color around, and suddenly it's genius." "Texture," Naomi corrected, her smile widening. "Layers, emotion, rubbish." The Duchess declared, "Give me a classic landscape, a fine portrait, something with dignity, not this mess of madness." Mr. Whitmore, ignoring the debate, leaned in closer to another painting, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something unseen. He saw the technique beneath the chaos, the method behind the madness. It was more than just color, it was calculated, deliberate, a hidden language. "Would you sell one of these?" he asked, his voice lower now, more serious. Naomi barely glanced at him. "5 guineas, she said indifferently. A pause, then carefully, he selected one, a dark, twisted landscape, where the sky itself seemed to be weeping red onto barren, thorn-covered ground. A subtle shiver crawled up his spine. There was something eerily familiar about the image, but he couldn't place it. As he turned back, he caught Naomi studying him, for the first time truly seeing him. Respect flickered in her gaze. "Interesting choice," she murmured. That evening, conversation turned to the island. The Duchess, in her usual commanding manner, declared, "We must see more of this place." "Naomi, you have a car." "A wreck of a thing," Naomi admitted. "It barely makes it up the hills." "Nonsense. We'll manage." The Duchess waved her off. "And if not, we'll hire a car." Mr. Whitmore noted the way Naomi's expression darkened slightly. It was brief, fleeting, but unmistakable. A shadow of something hidden, lurking beneath her nonchalance. Later, as they gathered for dinner, the Duchess was deep in conversation with a man who had arrived earlier, a sharp-eyed gentleman with a sun-weathered face. "Mr. Tomlinson has kindly offered to take us exploring," she announced grandly. "Kind indeed," Whitmore murmured, watching the man closely. Naomi said nothing. She only smiled, but Whitmore saw it, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she had seen Tomlinson before, as if she knew something no one else did, and for the first time, Whitmore wondered if their little excursion would be more than just a simple tour of the island. Maybe, just maybe, something was waiting for them out there, something that did not want to be found. The morning air carried a sharp bite, as Lady Eleanor adjusted the pearl brooch at her collar, her gaze sweeping over the rugged cliffs ahead. "I do hope you know what you're doing," she said, her voice rich with skepticism. "And I dare say you might be right. But you can't expect me to believe that all this modern nonsense is true art." She waved a gloved hand dismissively. "Still, let's not go into that. My time here is limited, and I intend to make the most of it. Tell me, Naomi, you have a car, don't you?" Naomi's expression was unreadable as she gave a small nod. "Yes, but excellent," Lady Eleanor interrupted. "We shall take a trip tomorrow. It's only a 2-seater. "Nonsense. There must be a dicky seat in the back. That will do for Mr. Ashford." A slow shudder ran through Mr. Ashford. He had seen the treacherous mountain roads that morning, the hairpin bends that seemed to lead straight into oblivion. Naomi tilted her head, studying him thoughtfully. "I'm afraid my car won't be much use," she said. "It's barely holding together as it is. Second-hand, a relic from another age. It crawls up hills when it feels like it. No passengers, I'm afraid. But there's a garage in the village. You can hire something there." "Hire a car?" Lady Eleanor sounded scandalized. "What an absurd idea. No, that won't do at all. Who was that rather distinguished gentleman who arrived before lunch?" "The one in the 4-seater, Mr. Thornton," Naomi supplied. "A retired judge. Spent years in India." "That explains the complexion," Lady Eleanor mused. "I was afraid it was jaundice. He seems respectable enough. I shall speak to him." By the time dinner was served, Lady Eleanor had secured their transport. Resplendent in black velvet and diamonds, she beckoned to Mr. Ashford from across the room. "Come here, Mr. Ashford," she commanded. "Mr. Thornton has been telling me the most fascinating things. And guess what? He has kindly agreed to take us on an excursion tomorrow in his car." Mr. Ashford regarded her with admiration. "We mustn't dawdle," she continued, leading the way to the dining table. "Mr. Thornton, do join us. You must finish telling me that intriguing story." After dinner, as they sipped their coffee, Lady Eleanor leaned in conspiratorially. "Naomi is coming as well, in her own car. That girl needs shaking out of herself. She's selfish, not self-absorbed, but completely indifferent to everything." "I don't think that's possible," Mr. Ashford said slowly. "Indifference must always be directed somewhere. Either a person is obsessed with themselves, or with something else entirely." Lady Eleanor waved her fan dismissively. "Nonsense. She's simply detached from life. And that, my dear Ashford, is dangerous." "Dangerous?" he repeated. She nodded sagely. "Detachment always masks an obsession, and obsessions, well, they're rarely harmless." The following morning, they set off early, baskets of provisions stowed away. Naomi, with her months of island experience, was to lead the way. Mr. Ashford approached her as she adjusted the straps of her satchel. "Are you certain I can't accompany you?" he asked wistfully. She smiled faintly. "You'd be far more comfortable in the other car. Padded seats, no rattling over bumps. Mine is an adventure all on its own. And the hills?" Naomi laughed. "Oh, that was just an excuse to save you from the dicky seat. The truth is, Lady Eleanor could have easily hired a proper car. She just chooses not to." Her voice lowered slightly. "She's the stingiest woman in England. But despite that, I can't help but like her." "Then I could come with you after all?" Mr. Ashford's eyes lit up. Naomi studied him for a moment. "Why are you so eager to ride with me?" He offered a gallant bow. "Can you blame me?" She smiled, but shook her head. "That's not the reason." A strange glimmer passed through her eyes. "But you can't come with me. Not today. Another day perhaps," he suggested politely. She gave a small curious laugh. "Another day. Well, we'll see." The convoy set off. They wound through the sleepy village streets, past whitewashed cottages, then curved along the bay where the water shimmered like liquid sapphire. They crossed a narrow stone bridge, climbing steadily higher as the coastline fell away beneath them. Upwards they went, twisting through nerve-shattering bends, cliffs dropping sheer to the sea. Below them, the island was a sunlit paradise, but here, among the peaks, thick grey clouds moved in, casting long shadows over the jagged rocks. The air grew colder. Mr. Ashford turned up his collar, fastening the buttons against the wind that carried whispers of something unseen. A storm was coming, and with it, something else. something neither he nor Lady Eleanor, nor even Naomi could yet foresee. The road twisted like a serpent along the mountainside, narrow and treacherous, carved into the rock like an ancient scar. The vehicle lurched forward, its tires gripping the crumbling edge of the precipice, as the wind howled like a mournful spectre, clawing at the windows. The blue bay stretched far below, shimmering in the fading sunlight, while the peaks ahead loomed, draped in thick veils of mist. Naomi's car led the way, its red taillights blinking like warning signals against the growing storm. Mr. Satterthwaite sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the edge as the road twisted again, revealing a dizzying drop to jagged rocks below. The air had turned sharp, biting at his face. He pulled his coat tighter, glancing at Naomi ahead. She drove steadily, but something about her, her unnatural stillness, her unwavering focus, made his stomach churn with unease. He had asked to ride with her earlier, and she had refused with a cryptic smile. Now watching her disappear around another bend, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The ascent was relentless. They were climbing to the world's edge. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. A place forgotten by time, where the sky met the land, and secrets lay buried beneath the stones. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The village was nothing more than a scattering of stone houses, their windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. Naomi stepped out first, stretching as the wind howled around them. "You were here," she said, her voice carried away by the wind. "The end of the world." Mr. Satterthwaite hesitated. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something old, like the breath of forgotten history. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on loose gravel. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. A man sat atop a boulder, his back to them, facing the vast emptiness beyond. He hadn't been there moments ago, and yet there he was, a slow, deliberate turn, a face revealed, a knowing gaze. Mr. Satterthwaite's breath caught in his throat. "Mr. Quin," he exclaimed, his voice laced with disbelief. "How extraordinary." Naomi's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. The wind howled louder. Somewhere in the depths of his chest, a terrible certainty settled. This was no chance meeting, and the end of the world was just the beginning. The road twisted like a serpent through the barren hills, each turn revealing a world more desolate than the last. Nathan Hale gripped the steering wheel tighter, his fingers stiff from the cold. He had ceased to admire the view long ago. The wind howled through the mountains, sharp as a blade, slicing through his coat, and sending an icy shiver down his spine. He longed for the comfort of a warm hotel, a roaring fire, and a stiff drink. Anything but this endless climb into the unknown. Ahead of them, Evelyn Monroe's small car pressed forward, her taillights glowing like embers in the thickening fog. Up, still up. They were high above the world now, the valleys falling away beneath them like shadows stretching into infinity. And then suddenly, she stopped. Nathan pulled up behind her, his heart drumming with an unease he couldn't quite place. Evelyn stepped out, her dark curls whipped by the wind. "We've arrived," she called over her shoulder, her voice barely carrying above the howling gusts. "At the edge of the world, but I don't think it's the best day for it." They climbed out into the biting cold, standing on the precipice of a place forgotten by time. A handful of ancient stone cottages clung to the mountainside, their roofs dusted with snow. A single wooden sign stood by the last house, the name carved into it in deep, uneven letters, Val del Ombre. Evelyn exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the freezing air. "That's what it's called officially," she said, "but I call it the edge of the world." She stepped forward, and Nathan followed. The road simply ended, behind them a winding ribbon of asphalt, before them nothing, just an abyss where the land fell away, plunging down into the unseen depths below, and far, far beyond, the sea, an endless sheet of grey stretching to the horizon. Nathan inhaled deeply. "It's an extraordinary place. You get the feeling that anything could happen here." He hesitated, suddenly uneasy, that you might meet someone you weren't expecting. As if summoned by his words, a figure materialized on a nearby boulder. A man sat there, his back to them, staring into the void. The wind had hidden his presence until now, and the sight of him sent a ripple of unease through Nathan's chest. It was as if he had been conjured from the mist itself. The man turned, and Nathan's breath caught. "Mr. Finch," he murmured, shock flooding his voice. The stranger smiled, calm, knowing. "Mr. Hale, fancy meeting you here." Evelyn stepped forward, eyeing the man with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Nathan forced himself to gather his composure. "Miss Monroe, this is Mr. Finch. He has a habit of appearing when least expected." Evelyn extended a gloved hand. "We're here for a picnic," she said, though there was something wary in her voice. "Though it seems we might freeze to death for—" Nathan shivered. "Perhaps we'll find shelter somewhere." "Not here," Evelyn muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Still, it's a view worth seeing." Nathan turned to Finch. "Miss Monroe calls this the edge of the world. Rather fitting, wouldn't you say?" Finch nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, quite a significant name. A place where one must make a choice, to turn back, or to step into the unknown." Evelyn frowned, suddenly uneasy. "What do you mean?" Finch met her gaze. "Some places demand decisions, and some places," his voice lowered, "some places do not allow one to leave the same as they arrived." Evelyn inhaled sharply. A gust of wind sent a fresh wave of snow swirling around them. "It's snowing," Nathan muttered, surprised. The sky had darkened, and the once peaceful snowfall quickly turned to an unforgiving storm. "What a perfect day for a picnic," Evelyn said dryly, though her voice was tight. A flurry of conversation erupted. "What now?" The storm was worsening by the second. Finch gestured toward a small half-buried structure at the edge of the village. "There," he said, "a cassicroute. They might have warmth. Coffee, if we're lucky." Desperate for shelter, they hurried inside, stomping snow from their boots as they entered the dimly lit space. A single flickering oil lamp cast elongated shadows on the stone walls. An old woman, wrapped in layers of wool, fed dry branches into a small fireplace, the flames dancing hungrily, as if eager to devour the darkness. Nathan stepped further inside, his pulse slowing. Then he stopped. They weren't alone. At the far end of the wooden table, 3 figures sat motionless, their faces half lit by the fire, eyes dark and unreadable. They weren't just strangers. Nathan recognized them, and they were people he should never have seen again. Evelyn froze beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "Nathan, what is this?" He swallowed hard, dread curling around his spine. "I don't know," he said, "but we weren't supposed to find them." Finch smiled, watching the scene unfold like a man who already knew the ending, and in that moment, Nathan understood. They had walked into something they couldn't walk out of. The storm raged outside, its icy fingers clawing at the small dimly lit inn that stood on the edge of the cliffside road. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. At the far end of the room, a woman sat like a statue of elegance and authority, her silver hair arranged in perfect waves, her sharp eyes glinting with an unreadable expression. Draped in soft gray fabric, she carried herself with the air of someone who had commanded attention her entire life, but in her poised fingers, a delicate teacup trembled ever so slightly, betraying something deeper beneath her calm exterior. Beside her sat a man of striking contrast, pale as if untouched by the sun, his jet-black hair slicked back with precision. His eyes, hidden behind round spectacles, seemed to watch everything without ever truly looking. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the wooden table, the only sign of the storm inside his own mind. On her other side, sat a plump, cheerful man who smiled too easily, his presence oddly out of place in the tension that thickened the air. Yet, despite his warmth, no one paid him much attention. Then, the door burst open. A gust of wind carried in the scent of rain, the howling of the storm, and the silhouette of a woman wrapped in a dark coat. "Naomi." She paused at the threshold, her breath shallow, her eyes darting across the room as if searching for something, or someone. The moment stretched unbearably. Then, "You're late," the silver-haired woman said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Naomi didn't respond. Instead, she stepped inside, her wet boots echoing against the wooden floor. But just as she turned towards the back of the room, a figure moved into her path. Mr. Quin. His presence was both commanding and effortless, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. His gaze locked onto hers, and she stiffened under its weight. "Sit down," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. Naomi hesitated. A flicker of defiance flashed across her face, but then, without a word, she obeyed, seating herself at the far end of the table, as distant from the others as possible. The tension in the room thickened, the air pressing down like an unseen force. Mr. Satterthwaite, ever the observer, watched in fascination. He turned towards the pale man with the glasses, recognition dawning on him. "You may not remember me," he began, his voice almost casual, "but my name is Satterthwaite." The man's fingers stilled, his lips curled into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "Oh," he murmured, "I never forget a name." Outside, the storm howled louder, but inside, something far more dangerous had already begun. The room was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of delicate china, and the occasional crisp rustle of linen napkins. It was a setting of understated opulence, where even the simplest gestures carried the weight of refinement. The long mahogany table gleamed under the dim glow of antique chandeliers, casting flickering golden light over the gathered company. At the far end of the table, a woman sat with effortless grace, a figure whose very presence commanded attention. Draped in soft, cascading layers of silver-gray fabric, she exuded an air of practiced elegance, her white hair a striking contrast against the darkness of the room. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, her fingers gliding over the stem of a crystal goblet, her lips parting ever so slightly before she spoke. She was Rosina Nunn, and even here, in a quiet dining hall, rather than on a grand stage, she was performing. To her right sat a man with piercing black eyes behind horn-rimmed spectacles, his sharply tailored suit pristine, his every movement carrying the precision of a conductor, directing an unseen orchestra. A faint smirk played on his lips as he spoke, his words rolling off his tongue like lines from a script. He gestured dramatically with his left hand, as if punctuating some unseen punchline, and a small murmur of laughter rippled around the table. To her left was a rather different presence altogether, a man of medium height and unremarkable features, with a smooth bald head that shone under the light. Unlike the others, he did not exude drama or command attention. Instead, he was absorbed in the meticulous task of unwrapping the contents of a large wicker hamper, carefully arranging the food before him with the precision of a jeweler inspecting rare gems. "Some more pâté, dearest?" he asked softly, his voice warm yet devoid of any real emotion. Rosina surrendered her half-eaten roll to him without protest. "Henry thinks of the most enchanting meals," she murmured, her deep contralto voice sending shivers through the air. "I always leave the commissariat to him." Her husband, Mr. Judd, the latest in a long string of them, merely chuckled. "Feed the brute," he said, patting her shoulder in a gesture that was at once affectionate and possessive. Mr. Vyse, seated further down, leaned in slightly toward Mr. Satterthwaite, his voice low and thick with amusement. "Odd creatures, women," he muttered. "That one, she lives for food, simply lives for it. I remember during Riders to the Sea, she was struggling with a particular line. I couldn't get the effect I wanted, the kind of distant sorrow that truly moves an audience. And then it struck me. I told her to think of peppermint creams. She adores peppermint creams, you see, and just like that, she had it. That faraway look, that deep yearning, it went straight to the audience's soul." Mr. Satterthwaite did not reply. Instead he watched Rosina closely, remembering the spell she had once cast over him, over thousands of others who had thrilled to her performances. She had always been a chameleon, shifting effortlessly between roles. 25 years a blonde, then a dramatic turn as a raven-haired tragedian, and now this latest incarnation, a sophisticated French marquise draped in silver and mystery. The Duchess, seated nearby, was murmuring in quiet conversation with her, and snippets of Rosina's voice drifted across the table. "The bread must be lightly toasted, you understand, then just a very thin layer of marmalade, rolled up and put in the oven for exactly 1 minute, no more, no less. Simply delicious." Vyse smirked again. "See what I mean? It's always about food," Satterthwaite turned his attention back to his own plate, reaching for a slice of cold ham when suddenly, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "I'm going out. It's unbearable in here." All eyes turned toward the speaker, a woman striking in both appearance and demeanor, standing at the far end of the room. Naomi. Her eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable, but there was an unmistakable tension in the set of her shoulders. She took a step toward the exit, her movements quick, decisive, but before she could slip away, another figure materialized in her path, Mr. Quin. He had appeared as if from nowhere, a presence so quietly commanding that the very air seemed to still around him. He was not a man of many words he need to be. His presence alone was enough. "Sit down," he said simply, his voice steady, leaving no room for argument, and to Satterthwaite's astonishment, Naomi hesitated, just for a moment, then, without another word, she stepped back, returning to her seat at the furthest end of the table. The atmosphere in the room shifted, something unseen stirred beneath the surface. There was a tension now, a sense that whatever had just transpired was not mere coincidence. The performance unfolding before them was no longer just theater, it was real, and the final act had yet to be written. The dining hall was thick with an air of quiet sophistication, the kind that concealed more than it revealed. Silverware clinked softly against fine porcelain, the hum of conversation weaving between the flickering candlelight and the muted rustle of silk and linen. At the head of the table, Rosina Nunn, ever the picture of practiced elegance, leaned forward, her fingers trailing lazily along the rim of a delicate goblet. "You produce plays, I hear, eh?" came a voice from further down the table. It belonged to a man with a thin fox-like face, his smile sharp yet lacking warmth. "I'm fond of a good play myself, Jim the penman." Now that was a play. Across from him, Mr. Vyse stiffened, a visible shudder running down his spine. His usually smug expression faltered for the briefest of moments before he regained his composure. "My God," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as though ridding himself of some unpleasant thought. Oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the tension, Rosina turned back to the Duchess, her voice lilting with an almost childlike delight. "A tiny clove of garlic," she instructed with a knowing smile. "Tell your cook, it's wonderful." Then, as if she had only just remembered, she sighed dramatically and turned to her husband. "Henry," she pouted, "I've never even seen the caviar." A chuckle rippled through the table. Mr. Judd, a solid man with an easy grin, shook his head in amusement. "You're as near as nothing to sitting on it," he said cheerfully. "You put it behind you on the chair." With a startled gasp, Rosina retrieved the small tin, her laughter ringing out like the tinkling of a wind chime. "Henry is too wonderful," she beamed. "I'm so terribly absent-minded. I never know where I've put anything. Like the day you packed your pears in your sponge bag," Henry added with a chuckle, shaking his head fondly, "and then left it behind at the hotel. My word, I did a bit of wiring and phoning that day." They were insured. Rosina sighed dreamily. "Not like my opal." For a moment her entire demeanor shifted. A shadow passed over her face, her ever-present smile faltering, replaced by something raw, something almost mournful. It was fleeting, barely a flicker before the mask of charm slid back into place. But Mr. Satterthwaite noticed it. He had seen many performances in his life, but few as masterful as Rosina's. He had often felt, in the presence of Mr. Quin, that he was merely playing a role in some unseen drama. Now the illusion was stronger than ever. The words "my opal" hung in the air, a cue waiting to be followed. "Your opal, Miss Nunn?" Mr. Satterthwaite prompted, leaning in ever so slightly. Rosina took her time responding, idly reaching for the butter dish before passing it to her husband. "Yes, my opal," she murmured. "It was stolen, you know, and I never got it back." "Do tell us, Mr." Satterthwaite encouraged, his interest piqued. She exhaled a wistful sigh escaping her lips. "I was born in October, you see," she began, her voice dipping into a melodic rhythm, as though she were reciting lines on stage. "So it was lucky for me to wear opals. And because of that, I wanted a real beauty. I waited a long time for it. They said it was one of the most perfect ones known, not very large, about the size of a 2-shilling piece. But oh, the color, the fire. A collective hush had settled over the table. Even the Duchess, who had been shifting uncomfortably, fell silent. It was stolen, Rosina continued, her voice thick with nostalgia, by a young man named Alec Gerard. He wrote plays. Mr. Vyse, who had been swirling his wine absent-mindedly, suddenly perked up. Very good plays, he interjected with professional authority. Why, I once kept one of his scripts for 6 months. Did you produce it? Asked Mr. Tomlinson, his curiosity evident. Vyse let out a short, incredulous laugh. Oh no, he said, as if the very idea was preposterous. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, but you know, at one time, I actually considered it. Rosina sighed again, but this time it was different, deeper, tinged with something unspoken. It had a wonderful part in it for me, she reminisced. Rachel's Children it was called, though oddly, there wasn't anyone named Rachel in it. She paused, her gaze drifting as though she were seeing something none of them could. He came to talk to me about it at the theatre. I liked him. He was nice-looking, and very shy, poor boy. Another pause, and then a small wistful smile played at her lips. I remember he brought me peppermint creams. Silence stretched across the room, thick with something unnamed. Mr. Satterthwaite observed the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle undercurrents of tension rippling through the guests. This was no ordinary dinner conversation. This was a story unfolding, a mystery weaving itself into existence before his very eyes, and at the center of it, Rosina Nunn, the ever-enigmatic performer, playing her most compelling role yet. The pieces were shifting, and somewhere in the shadows of the candlelit room, Mr. Quin watched, silent, waiting. You appreciate a good mystery, don't you? Said Eleanor Graves, her voice laced with amusement, as she swirled the wine in her glass. I do love a well-crafted tale, especially one with a twist. The Shadows Bargain. Now that was a story. Across the dimly lit dining hall, Edwin Vale's expression stiffened. My God, he muttered, a cold shiver running down his spine. A dash of saffron, interjected Lady Moreau, turning to the host with a conspiratorial smile. You should tell your chef, it's simply transformative. She sighed contentedly, glancing at her husband. Arthur, she said, her voice tinged with playful exasperation, I haven't even seen the infamous emerald necklace yet. You're practically resting on it, Arthur replied cheerfully. It was right behind you on the chair. Eleanor retrieved the velvet pouch hastily, flashing an apologetic grin. Arthur is remarkable. I'm so terribly absent-minded. I never know where I've put things. Like the time you tucked your pearl earrings inside a book of poetry and left it at that old library, Arthur teased. That was insured, Eleanor said dreamily. Not like my sapphire. A fleeting shadow of sorrow crossed her face, delicate yet profound. Mr. Lockwood, observing her from across the table, felt an eerie déjà vu. It was as if they were all players in a grand performance, their roles predetermined, their lines rehearsed. The words "my sapphire" were his cue. He leaned forward. Your sapphire, Lady Eleanor. Pass me the butter, dear. Thank you. She took a deep breath, then continued. Yes, my sapphire. It was stolen, you know, and I never got it back. Do tell us, urged Mr. Lockwood. She hesitated for only a moment before her voice took on a wistful cadence. I was born in September, so sapphires were always considered lucky for me. I waited years for the perfect one, a stone of such depth and fire that it was said to hold whispers of the night sky. Not enormous, but exquisite beyond compare. The room fell silent. Even the Duchess, who had been fidgeting moments ago, now seemed to be holding her breath. It was stolen by a young man named Felix Rains. He was a writer brilliant, but tormented. An exceptional writer, Mr. Vale interjected. I nearly published one of his works once. Did you? Asked Mr. Sterling, intrigued. Oh no, said Vale, shaking his head. But I did consider it. He wrote a play called Moonlit Promises, Eleanor continued. He came to see me about it. I remember he was nervous, quite charming in a way. He brought me sugared almonds of all things. The sapphire was on my dressing table. He had been to South America, you see, and knew something about rare stones. He picked it up, held it to the light. Her voice trailed off. Mr. Lockwood felt his pulse quicken. And then, the next morning it was gone. The silence stretched taut. They found the empty case in his apartment. Eleanor finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, he had been struggling financially, but the very next day he deposited an unusual sum into his bank account. He claimed a mysterious benefactor had given him a generous gift, but he could never prove it. He insisted the sapphire must have slipped into his pocket by accident. A weak excuse, don't you think? A strained chuckle echoed through the room. I had to testify in court. There were sketches of me in the papers for weeks. My agent said it was excellent publicity, but I would have traded it all to get my sapphire back. She sighed, shaking her head as if to rid herself of the memory. Have some honeyed figs, offered Arthur, breaking the spell. Eleanor brightened. Where are they? I handed them to you moments ago. With an air of familiar resignation, she reached for her silk handbag, tipping its contents onto the table. Powder compacts, letters, a pocket mirror, an ivory-handled letter opener, a small walnut, a folded silk handkerchief, and finally a peculiar wooden box. Lockwood leaned forward, a sharp glint in his eye. That's an old Eastern design, murmured Mr. Sterling. Remarkable craftsmanship, yes, isn't it? Eleanor picked it up absently. It was a gift. I can't quite recall who from. Lockwood's fingers twitched. A deep, unsettling instinct whispered to him. May I? He asked. She slid the box toward him. He turned it over in his hands. Two small wooden flaps on the lid, twisted ever so slightly. Something inside clicked. For the first time that evening, Eleanor's ever-composed face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Lockwood pushed the lid open. Inside, nestled among folds of faded silk, lay a sapphire of impossible beauty. The room exhaled as one. A stunned silence, a sharp intake of breath. And then Eleanor laughed, softly, delicately, almost as if she had been expecting this all along. What trick? Asked Mr. Judd, raising an eyebrow. God bless my soul, don't you know? He looked around at the curious faces, his own expression one of mild disbelief. Fancy that now. May I take the box for a moment? Thank you. He took the small ornate wooden box in his hands and pushed it open with a casual ease. Now then, can anyone give me something to put inside? Not too big. Ah, here's a small piece of Gruyere cheese. That will do splendidly. He placed the cheese inside and shut the box with deliberate precision. For a moment there was silence as his fingers moved, seemingly aimlessly over the surface. Then with a flourish he announced, Now watch closely. He opened the box again. It was empty. A hush fell over the room, broken only by a gasp. Mr. Judd blinked. Well, I never, he said, feigning astonishment. How do you do it? Someone murmured. It's quite simple, he explained. Turn the box upside down, move the left-hand flap halfway round, then shut the right-hand flap, and to bring our piece of cheese back, we simply reverse that, the right-hand flap halfway round, then the left one closed, keeping the box upside down, and now, hey presto, he slid the box open once more, but this time it wasn't just cheese that lay inside. A stunned silence fell over the room. There, glinting under the dim light, was something else, something round, something that shimmered with an otherworldly glow, flickering every color of the rainbow. My God! It was a sharp, unmistakable cry. Rosina Nunn stood up abruptly, her hands clasped to her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. My opal, how did it get there? Her voice trembled, and all eyes turned toward her. Henry Judd cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. I rather think, Rosie, my girl, you must have put it there yourself. A chair scraped against the floor as someone pushed away from the table. A figure stumbled toward the door and disappeared into the cold night air. Naomi Carlton Smith, Mr. Quin followed her. But when, do you mean? Rosina's voice wavered. Mr. Satterthwaite watched as realization dawned on her face. It took time, long painful seconds, before the truth finally took hold. You mean last year at the theater? Henry gave her an apologetic shrug. You do fiddle with things, Rosie. Look at you today, with the caviar. Rosina's mind was racing now, each piece falling into place with a sickening finality. I just slipped it in without thinking, and then Then I suppose I turned the box about and did the trick by accident. Her breath hitched, but then it came. The full horrifying weight of it crashed down upon her. But then Alec Gerard didn't steal it after all. A heart-wrenching cry escaped her lips, a sound of disbelief, of anguish. "Well," said Mr. Vyse quietly, "that can be put right now." "Yes, but he's been in prison a year." Rosina's voice broke. Then suddenly, she turned toward the Duchess, her expression sharp with urgency. "Who is that girl?" "The one who just left, Miss Carlton Smith," the Duchess replied, her voice cautious. "She was engaged to Mr. Gerard. She took the matter very hard." Mr. Satterthwaite slipped away unnoticed. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Naomi sat on the low stone wall, her fingers clutching a sketchbook, colored crayons scattered around her. Her eyes were downcast, but her shoulders trembled with barely contained emotion. Mr. Quin stood beside her, silent and still. She held out the sketchbook to Mr. Satterthwaite. It was rough, hastily drawn, but there was something about it. A swirling chaos of snowflakes, a figure in the center, blurred yet distinct. "Very good," murmured Mr. Satterthwaite, though his eyes were on Naomi rather than the drawing. Mr. Quin lifted his gaze to the sky. "The storm is over," he said quietly. "The roads will be slippery, but I do not think there will be any accident. Now." Naomi's lips curved into a strange knowing smile. "No, there will be no accident." Her voice was filled with something unreadable, a certainty that sent a shiver through Mr. Satterthwaite. She turned to him, her expression suddenly lighter. "Mr. Satterthwaite can drive back with me if he likes." A sinking realization settled in his chest. He understood now, understood just how far desperation had pushed her. "Well," said Mr. Quin softly, "I must bid you goodbye." He stepped away. Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze followed him, confusion knitting his brows. "Where is he going?" he asked, almost to himself. Naomi's voice was oddly detached. "Back where he came from, I suppose." But there isn't anything there," Mr. Satterthwaite stammered. His breath hitched as he watched Quin head toward the very edge of the cliff, the place where they had first seen him. "You said it yourself, it's the world's end." He turned back to Naomi, and hesitated before handing the sketchbook back. "It's very good," he said, "a very good likeness. But why? Why did you draw him in fancy dress?" Her gaze locked with his for the briefest second, and then with a whisper of a smile, she said, "I see him like that."